That night, I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't explain. The house was silent, too silent. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 3:12 a.m. Kira should have been home hours ago. My eyes drifted to her side of the bed, untouched, the pillow exactly where it had been when I lay down. We've been married for 6 years, and I've always believed we had a solid relationship. Kira is the kind of person who lights up a room just by walking into it. She's the one who brought energy and spontaneity into my quiet, structured world. She loves surprises, late-night adventures, and being the life of the party, things I admired but rarely took part in myself. But lately something had shifted. Kira had been distant, her laughter less frequent, her phone always clutched tightly in her hand. She started spending more time out, claiming she needed space to breathe. I didn't want to press. She wasn't the type to respond well to interrogation, but the nights she stayed out became longer, and her explanations grew thinner. Earlier that evening, we'd had an argument. She told me she was going out to meet some friends at a new club in town, but the way she said it felt off. I told her I didn't feel comfortable with her going, not because I wanted to control her, but because this nagging feeling wouldn't leave me alone. She snapped, saying I was being overprotective, that she needed this, that I wouldn't understand. In the end, I let her go. Watching her walk out the door, something about the way she avoided meeting my eyes stuck with me. Now, as I sat in the dark staring at the clock, my mind raced. Should I call her? Would she even pick up? Or was I just overthinking this like she always claimed I did? Whatever the case, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was different. I stayed awake the rest of the night. By 4 a.m., I'd sent Kira 3 texts and called her twice. No response. The silence wasn't just unsettling, it felt deliberate. She always had her phone on her, always. Even when she was out late, she'd at least shoot me a quick, "All good, see you soon." But tonight, nothing. When the sun finally rose, the tension in my chest hadn't eased. She hadn't come home. Her side of the bed remained untouched, like a mocking reminder that something was wrong. I stared at my phone, debating whether to call again, but my pride wouldn't let me. If she wanted space, fine, but why did it feel like she was pulling away for good? Around 7 a.m., I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. My heart raced. Relief? Anger? I wasn't sure what I felt, but I stayed in the kitchen, gripping my coffee cup tighter than necessary. When Kira walked through the door, she looked exhausted. Her makeup was smudged, her eyes red like she'd been crying. But she didn't say a word to me. She just grabbed a glass of water and headed straight for the shower. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. I didn't want to accuse her of anything. Not yet, but I needed answers. She paused mid-step, her back to me. "I told you I was at the club. I stayed out later than I planned. I'm sorry." That was it. No explanation for why she hadn't answered my calls. No acknowledgement of how her absence had left me spiraling all night. Just, "I'm sorry." It didn't sit right. Her voice was too flat, too rehearsed. After her shower, she seemed to bounce back, acting as if everything was normal. She even joked about how tired she was, like it was a badge of honor. I tried to shake off my frustration, telling myself I was being paranoid. But something in her demeanor had shifted. She was distant, guarded, like she was trying too hard to seem normal. Over the next week, the unease only grew. She started leaving the house more often, always with vague excuses. Running errands, meeting a friend, just need some fresh air. But when I'd ask where she was going, she'd give me that look, the one that said I was being unreasonable. Then there was her phone. It never left her side anymore. She'd even take it to the bathroom with her. Once, when she thought I wasn't looking, I saw her quickly swipe away a notification and glance at me like she'd been caught. I didn't say anything, but my mind started connecting dots that I wasn't ready to face. The worst part was the growing distance between us. The little things like how she used to rest her head on my shoulder while we watched TV, or how we'd laugh about stupid inside jokes, were gone. Conversations felt forced, like she was going through the motions. One night, I decided to test the waters. "Kira," I said casually, "you've been out a lot lately. Everything okay?" She froze for a split second, then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. Work's just been stressful. I need to unwind, you know." I nodded, but her answer didn't satisfy me. Something was happening. Something she didn't want me to know. And for the first time, I started wondering if I really wanted to know the truth. The tension between us was like a storm cloud that wouldn't go away. Every smile Kira gave me felt forced, every laugh hollow. I tried to convince myself it was in my head, that I was being paranoid. But the moments that didn't add up were stacking higher and higher. One night, she told me she'd be out late again. Work friends this time, she said, casually slipping on a pair of heels I hadn't seen her wear in months. She didn't even ask if I wanted to come along. She'd stopped doing that a while ago. I watched her leave, standing by the window as her car disappeared down the street. For a second, I almost felt guilty, like I was the one letting her slip away. But as the hours ticked by, that guilt twisted into frustration. Why was she so secretive lately? Why did it feel like there was this wall between us that I couldn't break down? By midnight, I couldn't sit still. I flipped through channels on the TV, checked my phone every 5 minutes, and paced the living room like a caged animal. I hated feeling this way. Restless, helpless, suspicious of the woman I'd loved for years. But I couldn't help it. Something wasn't right. When she finally came home, it was almost 2 a.m. She walked in quietly, her heels clicking softly against the floor. I stayed on the couch, pretending I hadn't been sitting there all night waiting for her. She glanced at me and paused. "You're still up?" "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "You're late." She shrugged, brushing past me. "I told you I'd be out late. You could have called." Kira stopped in her tracks, her back to me. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she turned, her expression guarded. I didn't think it was a big deal. It's not like I haven't stayed out late before. I opened my mouth to respond, but stopped myself. There was something about the way she said it that hit me wrong, like she was trying to downplay it, make me feel like I was overreacting. Maybe I was, or maybe I wasn't. She went to bed without another word, and I stayed on the couch, staring at the darkened TV screen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her, and she didn't seem to care. The next day, I decided I needed answers. I wasn't proud of what I did, but I felt like I had no choice. While Kira was in the shower, I grabbed her phone from the nightstand. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it. She'd never changed her password. It was still the same 4 digits we used for everything, but it felt wrong, like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. At first, I didn't see anything suspicious. Just the usual texts from her coworkers, social media notifications, some random app she barely used. But then I noticed something strange. There was a new messaging app on her phone, one I didn't recognize. I tapped it, my heart pounding in my chest. It was locked. A password prompt popped up, and I froze. Why would she need to lock just this one app? I set the phone back down, just as I heard the water turn off. My mind raced. I wanted to confront her, to ask her outright what she was hiding, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not without proof. That day, the feeling in my gut solidified. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing. Kira was hiding something, and I was going to find out what it was. After that night, everything felt heavier. I couldn't shake the image of that locked app or the unease it stirred in me. Kira carried on like nothing was wrong, but her smile seemed sharper now, her conversations more surface level. She wasn't the Kira I'd fallen in love with. Not anymore. I decided to play it cool. If I confronted her without proof, she'd deny everything and probably shut me out even more. So, I waited, observed, tried to act like nothing had changed. But inside, I was unraveling. The next few days were uneventful, almost suspiciously so. Kira stayed home more often, made dinner a couple of nights, and even suggested we watch a movie together, something we hadn't done in months. She was trying, I could tell, but it felt more like she was trying to pacify me than actually reconnect. One night, we sat on the couch watching some forgettable action movie. She leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder like old times. For a moment, I almost convinced myself everything was okay. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe she was just going through a phase, and things would go back to normal. But then her phone buzzed. It was subtle, a single vibration on the coffee table, but Kira tensed. I felt it immediately. She sat up, grabbed the phone, and turned away slightly as she unlocked it. "Work email," she said casually, but her voice was tight. I nodded, pretending to believe her. They're keeping you busy even at night, huh? She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the screen. Her thumbs moved quickly, typing something out before she locked the phone and set it down, screen facing the table. That moment solidified everything for me. Whatever was going on, it wasn't work, and it wasn't innocent. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I couldn't touch her phone again without raising suspicion, but I started paying attention to the little things. When she left the house, I noted the time and the excuses she gave. When she came back, I watched for inconsistencies in her stories. I felt like a detective in my own marriage, and I hated it. Then there was the night she went out again. She didn't say much, just that she was meeting the girls for drinks. I wanted to believe her, but my gut told me otherwise. As she got ready, I couldn't help but notice how much effort she was putting into her appearance. She spent almost an hour in front of the mirror, doing her makeup and fixing her hair. When she walked out of the bedroom in a dress I hadn't seen in years, my stomach churned. "You look nice," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks. Don't wait up, okay?" And just like that, she was gone. I sat on the couch for a long time after she left, staring at the door. The tension inside me was unbearable. I needed to know where she was going, who she was really with. So, I grabbed my keys and followed her. I told myself I wasn't the type of person to do this. Following my own wife? It felt desperate, pathetic even, but as I sat in the car parked down the street from our house, my hands gripping the steering wheel, I couldn't shake the thought. What if I'm right? What if everything I'd been feeling, everything I'd been suspecting, wasn't in my head? I had to know. Kira's car eventually pulled out of the driveway. I waited a few seconds before starting mine, keeping a safe distance as I followed her. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the engine. She drove across town, past the bars and restaurants she usually mentioned when she went out. But tonight, she wasn't stopping at any of those places. Instead, she turned into the parking lot of a small, out-of-the-way lounge I'd never heard of before. I parked a few spots away, trying to stay out of sight. She stepped out of the car, adjusting her dress in the reflection of the window. I noticed her checking her phone, typing something quickly, then looking up, scanning the lot like she was waiting for someone. My stomach dropped. A few minutes later, another car pulled in. It parked a few spaces from hers, and I watched as a man stepped out. He was tall, well-dressed, and clearly familiar to her. She smiled, that smile, the one she hadn't given me in months, and walked straight toward him. They hugged, lingering just a second too long, and then he held the door open for her as they walked into the lounge together. I sat frozen in my car, every emotion hitting me at once. Anger, heartbreak, disbelief. My mind raced, grasping for excuses, explanations. Maybe he was just a friend. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But deep down I knew. I'd known for weeks, maybe even months. I debated going in after them, but I didn't. Instead, I waited. I sat in the car for over an hour, watching the door, trying to calm the storm in my head. At one point, I saw them through the window, seated in a booth at the back. She was leaning in close to him, laughing, her hand resting lightly on his arm. It was like watching someone I didn't even know. When they finally came out, it was almost midnight. They didn't go their separate ways. Instead, they walked to his car. She didn't even glance at hers. My hands clenched the steering wheel so hard it hurt as I watched her climb into the passenger seat of his car, and they drove off together. I didn't follow this time. I couldn't. Whatever was happening, it was clear now. She wasn't meeting the girls. She wasn't decompressing from work stress. She was with him, and she'd been lying to me about it. When I got home, the silence in the house felt suffocating. Her empty side of the bed was like a wound I couldn't ignore. I stared at the ceiling, replaying everything I'd seen over and over again, wondering how we'd gotten here, wondering who he was, wondering if there was any way to come back from this. And then, out of nowhere, I remembered her phone, the locked app, the guarded glances. There was more to this story, and I needed to find out exactly what it was. The next morning, Kira came home around 9 a.m. She didn't even try to make up a story this time. She just breezed in, gave me a quick, "Hey," and headed straight for the shower. It was almost insulting How casual she acted, like I hadn't been awake all night replaying every second of what I'd seen. I waited in the kitchen, my hands gripping a mug of coffee I wasn't drinking. When she finally emerged, dressed in fresh clothes and still avoiding my eyes, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Where were you last night, Kira?" My voice was calm, but the weight behind the question was impossible to miss. She froze for half a second before turning to me with a practiced smile. "I told you, I went out with the girls." My stomach churned. The lie was so effortless, so automatic. "Really?" I asked, standing up. "Because I followed you." Her face went pale. The smile disappeared in an instant, replaced by something I couldn't quite read. Shock? Fear? Guilt? "What?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I followed you," I repeated, my tone sharper now. "I saw you meet him. I saw you walk into that lounge. I saw you leave with him." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she settled on, "You had no right to do that." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh even to my own ears. "No right? Are you serious right now? You've been lying to me for weeks, maybe longer, and I'm the one in the wrong." "It's not what you think," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "Then tell me what it is," I shot back. "Explain it to me, because from where I'm standing, it sure looks like you're sneaking around with someone else." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might actually come clean. But instead, she went on the defensive. "You've been smothering me," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't even go out without you accusing me of something." I stared at her, stunned. "Smothering you? Are you kidding me? All I've done is ask where you're going, who you're with, basic things any husband would want to know. And you've done nothing but lie." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said quietly. I needed someone to talk to. Someone who didn't make me feel so trapped." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So, it's my fault now? I drove you to this?" "I'm not saying that," she said quickly, but the damage was already done. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I'm sorry, okay? I didn't want this to happen. I wanted to yell, to scream, to demand answers. But instead, I just stood there, staring at her as the weight of her betrayal crushed me. "Who was he?" I finally asked, my voice barely audible. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," I said firmly. "I deserve to know who he is." For a moment, she hesitated, then sighed. "His name is Ryan. He's someone from work." The name felt like a slap in the face. I didn't know much about Ryan, but I'd heard her mention him in passing, always casually, like he was just another coworker. I never thought twice about it. I couldn't stand to be in the same room with her anymore. "I need some air," I muttered, grabbing my keys. "Wait, where are you going?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. "Out," I said, my tone cold. "Don't wait up." I walked out the door without looking back, my mind racing. I had no idea what my next move would be, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I drove aimlessly for hours that day, my mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. I replayed everything Kira had said, her excuses, her justifications, her tears. And Ryan. The name echoed in my head like a taunt. He wasn't just someone from work. He was the man who had stepped into my marriage like it was his for the taking. By the time I got home, it was dark and the house was silent. Kira's car was still in the driveway, but she hadn't tried to call or text me. Part of me wondered if she was giving me space or if she was just trying to avoid more questions. Either way, I wasn't interested in hearing any more of her lies. The next day, I went to work as usual, but my mind wasn't there. Every minute felt like a countdown to something I couldn't quite define yet. That afternoon, I made a decision. If Kira wasn't going to give me the truth, I'd find it myself. I started by looking up Ryan. I'd heard his name enough times to know his last name, and it wasn't hard to find him online. His social media accounts were public, and scrolling through his photos made my blood boil. He was everything I wasn't: tall, athletic, always smiling in that overly confident way. His captions were full of motivational nonsense, and he had a knack for posting pictures with women. always just on the edge of inappropriate. And there was Kira, in a few of them, smiling in the background at office parties I hadn't been invited to. But the real jackpot came when I dug deeper. On one of his posts, buried in the comments, was a casual exchange with a coworker. Ryan mentioned a secret spot he liked to visit after work, a secluded cabin on the edge of town that his family owned. I couldn't believe my luck. I took a day off work, telling Kira I needed some time to clear my head. She didn't argue. She barely even looked at me. That was fine. I didn't need her approval for what I was about to do. I drove out to the area Ryan had mentioned in his comment, feeling a mix of nervous energy and grim determination. The cabin wasn't hard to find. It sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by dense woods. As I pulled up, I saw his car parked outside, and my stomach churned. I wasn't sure what I'd expected to find, but the reality of seeing his car there, knowing he was inside, made my blood run cold. I didn't knock. I didn't hesitate. I walked up to the door and pushed it open. The cabin was small, and it didn't take long to spot Ryan sitting at a table, his laptop open in front of him. He looked up, startled, as I stepped inside. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cautious. "You're Ryan," I said, my tone flat. "Kira's friend from work." His face paled, and I knew I had him. "Look, man, I don't know what she told you, but—" I cut him off. "She told me enough." He stood up, raising his hands defensively. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. It just happened. It just happened," I repeated, the words dripping with venom. "You stepped into my life, my marriage, and now you're telling me it just happened?" "Look," he started, but I wasn't interested in hearing his excuses. I leaned closer, my voice low and steady. "You think this is over? It's not. You're going to regret every second you spent with her." Ryan tried to stammer out a response, but I turned and walked out before he could finish. I didn't trust myself to stay. I'd said what I needed to say, and judging by the look on his face, my message had landed. Back in my car, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. It wasn't revenge in the way I'd imagined, but it was a start. Ryan wouldn't forget our conversation anytime soon. And as for Kira, she wasn't off the hook either. When I got home that night, Kira was sitting at the kitchen table, her phone in her hand. She looked up when I walked in, her expression unreadable. I set my keys on the counter and didn't say a word. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. "Where were you?" she finally asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Out," I replied, mirroring the cold, detached tone she'd used so many times before. Her eyes flickered with something, regret, maybe, or guilt, but she didn't press further. Instead, she stood and walked to the sink, her back to me. For a moment, I considered letting it all out right then and there, telling her about Ryan, about the cabin, about everything I'd seen and heard. But something stopped me. The truth was, I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed to figure out what I wanted, what my next steps would be. And more than that, I wanted her to sit with the weight of her lies for a little longer. Over the next few days, I began taking small, deliberate actions. I made copies of important documents, quietly transferred some of our shared savings into an account she couldn't access, and started consulting with a lawyer. I wasn't planning on making any rash decisions, but I wanted to be prepared for whatever came next. Kira seemed to sense the shift. She became more attentive, more present, like she was trying to patch the cracks in our relationship with sudden acts of kindness. She started cooking dinner again, asking how my day was, even suggesting we take a weekend trip together. It might have worked once, but now, everything she did felt calculated, like she was trying to cover her tracks rather than repair what was broken. One evening, she asked me outright, "Are you still upset about the other night?" "I told you it wasn't anything serious." I put my fork down and looked at her, really looked at her. "What wasn't serious, Kira? Sneaking around? Lying? Or whatever it is you have with Ryan?" Her face went white, and for a second, I thought she might actually come clean. But instead, she fell back into old patterns. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said, her voice trembling. "Ryan and I, it was just, I don't even know what it was." "You don't know?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You don't know what it was? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks a hell of a lot like you chose him over me." "That's not fair," she snapped, tears welling up in her eyes. I never meant to hurt you. But you did, I said, my tone hard. You lied to me. You betrayed me. And now you expect me to just what? Pretend it didn't happen? She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she broke down, sobbing into her hands. A part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her we'd figure it out. But another part, the part that had spent weeks unraveling under the weight of her deceit, couldn't bring itself to care. That night, I slept in the guest room. Kira didn't come looking for me. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. I couldn't keep living like this, walking on eggshells, questioning everything, pretending like we could fix what had been broken. It wasn't healthy for either of us. I sat down at my laptop and started drafting an email to my lawyer. The email to my lawyer was brief and to the point. I outlined what had happened, requested guidance on the next steps, and asked about protecting my financial interests. Hitting send felt like closing a door, a small but final step toward reclaiming control of my life. Kira must have sensed the shift because she grew quieter in the following days. She'd stopped trying to make things better, stopped offering fake smiles and forced gestures. Instead, she walked around the house like a ghost, barely acknowledging my presence. It was like she knew the inevitable was coming, but couldn't bring herself to face it. A week later, I sat her down in the living room. "We need to talk," I said, my tone steady. She nodded, but didn't look at me. "I know. I've spoken to a lawyer," I continued, watching her closely for a reaction. Her face crumpled, but she didn't speak. Whatever this is not working anymore. You broke something between us, and I don't think it can be fixed." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't try to argue. "I never wanted this to happen," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice firm. "And it's not just about the affair. It's about the lies, the distance, the way you made me question everything I thought I knew about us." "I know," she said again, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of her quiet sobs. Then, I stood up. "I'll be staying at a friend's place for a while," I said. "You can take some time to figure out what you want to do next, but I think it's best if we both have some space." She didn't try to stop me. She didn't even look up as I packed a bag and walked out the door. The days that followed were strange. There were moments of deep sadness, of course, but also moments of relief. I'd spent so long living in a cloud of doubt and suspicion that stepping away from it felt like breathing fresh air for the first time in months. I leaned on friends and family, who rallied around me in ways I hadn't expected. They reminded me that this wasn't the end of my story, just the end of a chapter. And slowly, I started to believe them. As for Kira, she sent me a few messages, apologies, mostly, but I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Whatever she was going through, it wasn't my responsibility anymore. My focus was on rebuilding my life, piece by piece, and learning how to move forward. Now, months later, I feel like a different person. Stronger somehow. Wiser maybe. The pain of Kira's betrayal hasn't completely faded, but it no longer consumes me. If anything, it's a reminder of how much I've grown, of how far I've come. To anyone reading this who might be in a similar situation, I'll say this: trust your gut. Don't let doubt or fear keep you trapped in a place where you're not respected or valued. You deserve honesty. You deserve loyalty. And most of all, you deserve peace. I found mine, and I know you can too.